I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Bodor. She's the Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations at NAAEE. And Sarah, I will turn it over to you from here. And again, thanks to you all for attending today.
Thanks, Dave. And yeah, I echo Dave's thanks to all of you for joining. Thanks for taking time out of your day and your conference experience to join this session. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and have a little presentation here. This is a session focused on building a coalition for climate change education, and I welcome your participation today. As Dave said, I'm Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations for NAAEE, and I'm just really happy to be here with all of you. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're hoping to cover here today, I'm going to give a little bit of background about a new coalition that is emerging, focused on advancing climate literacy, climate change education policy, a little bit about the activities we've taken on so far, what we hope to do in the coming weeks and months. But I really also hope we can get to a point where we could actually have a discussion. I would love to invite some thinking from you here in this room about how we as a field can become more proactive and more strategic in our advocacy efforts for environmental ed broadly, but also very specifically for climate change education policy as well. While we're getting started, I would love if you want to go ahead and pop your name and your organization where you're zooming in from in the chat so that we can start to virtually get to know one another. I see some familiar faces and names, but I also see many faces and names that I'm not familiar with. So that's really exciting. I'm happy to have some new folks joining today. So I do want to start with just a tiny bit of background for anyone who might not be as familiar with NAAEE on kind of the role that we have traditionally played in advocacy, broadly for environmental education and increasingly specifically for climate change education. So as a professional association for environmental education, we have long considered advocacy important to our work, to our mission as a backbone organization for the field. We participate in outreach on the Hill in support of environmental education, but we also try to engage our NAAEE affiliate organizations, our partners, our members in advocacy. We try to provide training and tools to make advocacy easier and more accessible for educators. And one of the ways that we do that is through our grassroots action network. We hold monthly calls on the first Thursday of the month. And we also periodically check in with our partners, many of them who are in DC, but some all over the country, who are thinking about strategy for environmental education, advocacy, to sort of think about, are there new opportunities that we should be engaging in or looking at down the road, and how can we improve the tools and training that we're providing. I will just note that I've been at NAAEE for 6 years in this role, and it's the first time such a position existed within the organization. And so while we've seen tons of volunteer hours go into our advocacy efforts, it's really relatively recently in the grand scheme of things that the organization has really invested human resources in advocacy for the field of environmental education. Just to touch on sort of our broad policy priorities, we have historically focused very heavily on the annual appropriations process for the federal budget, those really critical grant programs that probably you're all familiar with at EPA and at NOAA, funding for the Office of Environmental Education at EPA, and the grant programs that office supports, and then the environmental literacy grant programs and the BWET, the Bay Watershed Education and Training programs that are administered by NOAA, have been kind of our bread and butter for decades. They really are, sort of stand out in terms of the federal budget, providing, very relatively modest but incredibly critical support to our field. We've also advocated for the Climate Change Education Act for more than a decade. It's kind of a detail, but we're increasingly sort of advocating for funding for climate change education, sort of separate from a standalone piece of legislation. And I'm happy to talk about the weeds of that with anybody who might be interested, but that's not really the focus of our conversation today. And then, you know, in terms of trying to take advantage of the times that we're in, we're really looking closely at what's happening in Washington, D.C. around budget reconciliation, the infrastructure package, and what are the opportunities for any funds that will go directly to schools. And then last, we've spent a fair amount of time trying to develop tools to help state and local partners advocate for the use of COVID relief funds in some small portion to go towards environmental and outdoor education. So let's shift, though, to this work around climate change education and the development of a coalition for climate education policy. There is, as I'm sure all of you know, just incredible work underway to advance climate literacy. Many of you may be engaged in these efforts and efforts that are not listed here. This is just the tip of the iceberg. You know, there have been networks in place to advance climate education and climate literacy for many, many years. There are also newer efforts. You may have seen just within the last month, the release of the K-12 Climate Action Report coming out of the Aspen Institute, which really provides some strong recommendations for federal, state, and local policies that would really engage schools, both operationally, but also from an instructional standpoint in our efforts to address the climate crisis. If you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to check it out. Secretary John King was a co-chair of that commission that produced that report, and he'll be speaking later this week. And I can almost guarantee that he'll be talking about some of the elements of this report. There are also lots of youth activists and other organizations who are doing just incredible work in the lead up to COP26 in an effort to make sure, obviously, that our commitments are bold, but there is a whole host of organizations that have been working to make sure that climate literacy is a priority, not just for the United States, but for leaders around the world. So I just want to, you know, again, this is sort of just skimming the surface, but I want to really acknowledge that there are educators and experts who have been working in this space for a long, long time. And I am just anecdotally will note that I'm seeing just tremendous momentum and engagement, particularly at the state and local level around policies to implement climate change education more systemically and also climate justice education more systemically into our schools. So with all that going on, why do we need a coalition for climate education policy? Well, just a few reasons. I think if you paid any attention, immediately after our last election, there was sort of a clear and immediate focus on the climate crisis and just a number of activities and actions that made it clear that this wasn't really just lip service, but that, you know, through appointments and executive orders, that there was sort of beginning to see a sort of immediate organization around this idea of climate change and environmental justice. But as we've so often seen in our field, while there was this sort of whole of government kind of verbal commitment to addressing the climate crisis, education, once again, is not often and early recognized as one of the key tools in our efforts to address the crisis. And so there were a number of organizations that really clamored early on to ensure that the US Department of Education, for example, was one of those partners that was being charged to come to the table to talk about what a whole of government approach to the climate crisis should look like. So there's lots of good work happening around policy. There's lots of good work happening in kind of the education space and in the sort of climate activism space, but there seems to be a little bit of a gap where the nexus of those efforts might sit. And so we really saw an urgent opportunity to really align and amplify our voices on behalf of some critical policies, recognizing that all of the organizations, or many of the organizations, and NAAEE certainly falls into this category, while we are fervently committed to these issues, we are relatively small players in a sea of, much bigger, much louder, and well-resourced actors. And so coming together really makes sense, so that we can have sort of collective impact in this work. So, just you probably all belong to coalitions, have participated in coalitions. You may facilitate coalitions yourselves. So some of the powers of a coalition are probably obvious, but I think one, that I just would speak to is this idea of a common agenda, but also a comprehensive agenda. I think this is a time for all of us to be thinking big and bold, and maybe sort of outside of our comfort zones in terms of what we're capable of as a field, and not kind of giving elected officials and leaders the opportunity to take a singular action around climate change education and sort of consider that box checked, and that sort of, request granted, but really to think holistically about centering education in any solution to the climate crisis, because we know that we're not going to be able to meet and sustain our goals under the Paris Climate Agreement without a climate literate workforce, without climate literate communities, without climate literate schools. And so again, just collaborating, pooling our resources. Also, a coalition, it can be helpful just in terms of keeping one another up to date. What are you working on? What advances are you seeing? How can I harness my network to get behind your initiative? So hoping to really create a space that's really, truly collaborative, and where different individuals from different organizations can kind of take turns stepping up, stepping back, and taking on leadership roles. So this slide gives you a sense of some of the partners that have been working together early on to start to think about what are some early wins that we can have as a field when it comes to leveraging, again, this pretty quickly moving, as far as, federal government moves quickly, but pretty quickly moving and urgent effort. This group of folks, representatives from each of these organizations, have come together through regular working group calls to, again, share updates with one another, to collaborate around what some action items and important steps might be, and then to try to communicate back out to our network. So most of these organizations represent a network. And I will just say, that we're sort of building this ship while we're sailing it. And so this is sort of a working group that has come together kind of out of necessity and urgency. But part of the conversation here today is to think about sort of who else wants to be involved beyond this set of organizations. We have about 100 organizations that have signed on to join the coalition. And you can see a list of those at our website at climateedpolicy.org. But we're still sort of figuring out what the shape of this looks like. And we invite that to be a collaborative and iterative process. So again, tremendous sense of urgency and opportunity, and really wanting to kind of put kind of our logos and egos aside to figure out how can we as a field really rise to the occasion and meet this moment, and get sort of education, environmental education, climate change education kind of onto the radars of decision makers as they're thinking about how we can best meet our goals under the Paris Climate Agreement. So what have we been doing? Sort of still before we even became a coalition that had a website, groups of us were loosely starting to do outreach to the different transition teams of the Biden administration, reaching out to the transition team for the Department of Education, reaching out to transition team for EPA and other agencies, to just kind of let them know that there is this powerful field of environmental educators who want to be a resource to the administration as they think about the role of education in our efforts to address climate and other complex environmental problems. We also did a bunch of early sign-on letters. Many of you may have received these sign-on letters in your inboxes. Really, as appointments were being announced, we were sending up sign-on letters expressing our support for the nominations of various folks to various positions. We have much more recently shifted. Obviously, that's sort of like ancient history now. Our sign-on letters now have been much more timely around what's going to be included in reconciliation, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we did a little bit of work with trying to make the case for considering US K-12 public schools, both, again, facilities and curriculum and instruction in what is called the nationally determined contributions. That's part of what we have had to provide under the Paris Climate Agreement to sort of start to demonstrate what sorts of emission reduction commitments the United States thought that we would be able to make. I would say we had only marginal success in that effort, but we did raise awareness among folks having those conversations about the fact that there is data and projections for what it might look like if we were to electrify school buses, for example, if we were to really green our school facilities, what kind of a dent we could be making, recognizing that the infrastructure of the US public school system is enormous. And then finally, as I mentioned, we do advocate for appropriations every year, and we really stepped up our requests for funding, asking for increases in federal appropriations. Again, the jury is very much still out on whether those efforts will be successful, but we do have some hope that there will be some new funding for climate change education that would go to NOAA, and that would be on top of some increases to their environmental literacy and BWET grant funding. And I am just going to pause real quick and see. Please continue to share your resources in the chat box. This is really important. I do see questions about the scope of the coalition, and I would say that we are primarily focused on US policy, although our Global Environmental Education Partnership, the GEEP, does work globally and does a lot of shared learning across countries. And there's a significant focus on climate change education in that sort of informational sharing. And I would encourage you to check that out. I'm also happy to have follow-up conversations about what it might look like to be more collaborative. This is obviously a global effort, and it's going to take all of us. All right. So I mentioned that there's some work that we're doing right now around this budget reconciliation package, and I want to get into that just a tiny bit. I know that this might not be something that everybody is tracking super closely, but as you may know, there is a pending piece of bipartisan legislation, commonly referred to as the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's also unfortunately referred to as BIF quite frequently as an acronym, but it includes a lot of funding for really brick and mortar infrastructure, roads, bridges, and things like that. There were some high hopes for some climate related funding in that bill, and most of that did not come to fruition. And so there's this second effort to fund what some in Washington, D.C. are calling human infrastructure. So this is where you're hearing the conversations around things like, paid family leave, universal pre-K, childcare, making the child tax credit permanent, et cetera. But it also, the various proposals that have been floated out there would potentially include really significant advances for addressing climate change. And we and many others, including a lot of the organizations that were listed on that earlier slide, have been really pushing for funding that would really specifically target climate change education, specifically target schools and the infrastructure footprint of schools. So here's just a little bit about what might be included. If you are following this issue, you know that it's literally like the story changes by the hour. And so I was going back through PowerPoint presentations that I've given over the last few months, and I've sort of like, oh, I shouldn't say that with very much certainty anymore. Oh, and I should hedge a lot more on this particular piece of it. I should take that piece out of it altogether. So do not etch this into concrete anywhere. But there continues to be a push to have climate change education funding included. I would flag on that first bullet that we are optimistic that that funding may come through, as I mentioned before, in the regular budget process. And so reconciliation might not need to be a target for climate change education funding. There is an entire coalition focused on school infrastructure, has been working on this issue for years, that we participate in. It's called the BASIC Coalition. And they and others in sort of the green schools, environmental education space have been really pushing hard, continuing to push hard for provisions of what was known as the Reopen and Rebuild America Schools Act to be included in reconciliation. And the important piece there, I think for today's purposes, is that right now the proposal that passed the House would include $82 billion for K-12 schools. And through a lot of advocacy over the last couple of years, the definition of school facilities makes it explicitly clear that school grounds would be eligible for that funding. This money would target the highest need schools in the United States in terms of modernizing school facilities, making them safer and healthier, adding in some sustainable practices, and then, as I said, improving school grounds for learning and for climate change mitigation. And then lastly, there is a civilian climate corps. Again, number of different proposals, so the specifics aren't entirely clear, but funding essentially for a service corps that would put young emerging professionals primarily to work at the community level, allowing them to make a living wage, potentially earn some money for their education, but be really on the front lines of helping to address local climate change issues. Important workforce development component for sure. Before I go on, let me again just take a quick peek at the chat. Huge thanks to you, Brock, for dropping links into the chat. Really appreciate that, because I am terrible at multitasking on Zoom when I am presenting. So I will stop sharing in just a couple minutes. I just want to get through a couple more slides. One other thing that we have been working on as sort of part of our coalition work, but also within our affiliate network at NAAEE, and a number, again, of other organizations are working and thinking about this and putting resources together for this, is funding that in the United States, state and local education agencies have received for emergency relief funds through the various COVID relief packages that have passed. So this chart just shows the funding that passed through to local education agencies in each of the three packages beginning back in March of 2020, and the most recent being passed in March of 2021. with a few years timeline for school districts to obligate that funding, and just tremendous flexibility about how those funds could be used. But generally speaking, the funding can be used to do things to provide a safe and healthy learning environment. And these are just some of the components that school systems are considering as they think about how to apply these funds. So that was a lot of sort of like policy jargon in just a short period of time. But what I really want to sort of get to is that we are experiencing finally an unprecedented focus on the urgency of climate change. We are also at the same time seeing some historic investments in schools, potential additional historic investments in facilities. Again, the jury is very much still out on that. But the possibility of funding that will shape education for years to come. And so it's just impossible, I think, to look at that set of facts and not come to the conclusion that now, if ever, is really the time for the field of environmental education to engage in this work. But we have a lot of big questions and next steps as we sort of try to put together this emergent coalition. As I said, we've been sort of flying or building the plane as we fly. And we've got this working group in place, but we're also looking to maybe put together a bit of a governance structure for a coalition. And we've actually partnered with the Meridian Institute, who's been helping us do sort of a third-party evaluation by interviewing the partners that have been engaged in the coalition so far. They're going to be sending out more broadly a survey that I would invite folks to participate in, to get input more broadly about how a coalition can best serve the needs of the field, and how people want to be involved, and even sort of like how much do you want to be communicated with about this kind of stuff. And I think the idea there is really to put enough structure in place that we have structures for communication and transparency and opportunities for engagement. But we're not looking to start a new organization. Everybody's got a full plate. Like, this is really about how can we best leverage the strengths of our field without creating additional sort of structural burdens. And as I said, as part of that, we want to really think about the best ways to engage partners and advocates. And then these other two questions are kind of bigger, more long-term questions, which is thinking about, right now, we are doing something that's very much in response to kind of our perception of the time, but how can we build a durable coalition? Do we need a durable coalition, I guess, is another way to start that conversation. But relatedly, that last question is coming from a sense that we are limited in our resources. We're all limited in our capacities for advocacy. But it would sure be nice to be sort of shaping the narrative going forward and thinking about being strategic and being proactive, and not always kind of thinking, oh, this thing is happening, how can we kind of get EE or climate change education on the radar, and kind of wanting to think about, are there longer term ways that we can build our capacity as a field so that we have, like, that we're at the table early and often, if you will. And so really, I would love to just stop sharing my screen and invite some discussion and thoughts from others about that. And I know you can certainly feel free to use the chat, and I will check and see what folks are in there, but I would just invite you to feel free to take yourself off mute if you want to.
Hi, Sarah, I have a question.
Yep.
This is Amber Schultz. I'm with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we're the state wildlife agency, and I'm within the Fish and Wildlife Education Division. And we are kind of like long-term looking at doing something similar as far as building some kind of coalition that brings together the scientists and the teachers and different stakeholders to understand how we can add supplementary or complementary like curriculum and material and guides to help resources for teachers here in Nebraska to make it Nebraska focused. So how is it going to impact our state? Because I know from a lot of the best practices, talking about that local impact is really important. I guess my question, like a bigger picture question is, I hear that you say that it's all of a sudden you're seeing this momentum of all these people trying to do things, which is fantastic. And it's a sense of urgency. We need to start doing this. I find myself as I look to these resources, it's almost overwhelming, all these different pockets of people and organizations and all this stuff trying to kind of get at the same thing, because we're all feeling all of a sudden this, this urgent feeling. I guess I don't know where my question is with this. Can you speak to how you might navigate like all those different resources? It feels very overwhelming to like, where do we even look to start for those basic resources for the different organizations that you might look to partnering with when you're potentially looking at building even a state, like a local coalition?
That's a great question. And I am so empathetic with you in terms of that sort of feeling of being overwhelmed and that flurry of activity and how to harness that energy in a way that gets you somewhere. I don't know that I really have the answer, but I would say like start simple in terms of, convening a call can be one really important step, and you can have no other goal for that convening than to share information. And that's kind of the way that this particular coalition has really started was first, it was just who wants to hop on a call next Wednesday and sort of start to update one another. And then we decided we wanted to talk again the next Wednesday. And then we decided we wanted to, and each time someone brought someone new. And in many ways, I think that feels, I don't want to say that there's like a threatening, but we can be turfy, right? Or, and we, as I mentioned before, we all have limited resources, but just kind of providing a space where people can talk about the work they're doing, but also what is a resource that maybe you have to share. That is, the way that you can really start to build some relationships and trust. In terms of the resources themselves, I would be happy to talk to you with more specificity. One of the things that we've been trying to do in partnership with our affiliates is to the best of our ability, like respond with resources that we've been asked for, really kind of particularly in light of COVID and the impacts that it's had on so many of our organizations. And then to kind of just say, take these and make them yours in any way that makes sense. Use whatever part of it is helpful to you and get rid of the stuff that's not. And I realize that in and of itself might be kind of a burden. Like, it's sort of like, here, I made this thing for you. Now you have a bunch of work to do to make it fit your needs, but kind of trying to create as much of sort of like open source resources and materials as possible. And I do see that Amy at 10 Strands has put a link into the K-12 climate action plan that I referenced earlier. And it's true, there's a lot in there. If you start at just the local, some of the local recommendations that might give you a starting point. I would also just invite you to be in touch, Amber. I would love to talk with you more about that. And Carolee, I see that you have your hand up, and thank you for your patience.
No worries. Thank you. I have two questions, actually. The first is the coalition considering advocacy for children and, well, actually the broader scale of education's and mental health with respect to climate change. So thinking about the psychological aspects about climate change, that's the first question. A very different second question is what about issues of framing for the coalition? I'm just very concerned, just paying attention, you know, obviously we all are, on discussions and the pushback by school boards on masks and vaccines and critical race theory. And if climate change goes down that rabbit hole, we're in deep trouble. So what is the, how is the policy effort being framed?
So, gosh, I mean, I think, well, I'll take the second question first. I think two things, and we could probably talk about, I mean, we could talk about both of your questions for an entire session, but in terms of framing, I think we are first, when it comes to sort of the role of school facilities themselves, the operations of facilities, the food systems involved in the school systems, the transportation systems, there's data that we can point to show how investments in those facilities and in those systems will have a positive impact on our emission reduction goals. They also will make schools healthier places for kids to be. I mean, it's so there's a lot to get into in terms of the sort of undeniable impacts, even things like, you know, I live in Maryland, and earlier this school year, right, like days into our schools opening, Baltimore City Public Schools had to close a number of schools because they don't have air conditioning and it was too hot. And there's, you know, research that shows that even a single degree of an increase in the indoor temperature has a negative impact on learning and cognition and retention. And so I think there's a lot of ways to frame the discussion that's much more about data and also about, you know, children's health and well-being, that kind of, it just bypasses altogether a debate about climate change. It's kind of like, you know, do we want to close schools or do we want them to be open? And if we want them to be open, then there's just certain practical facilities needs that the school buildings have. I also think that the earlier question, I mean, I don't want to be glib about the fact that we're seeing controversies pop up in education in all kinds of places that we didn't think we would be seeing controversies pop up when it comes to children's health and well-being. So I don't want to minimize that it's tricky, but I also think that we can avoid arguments that we don't need to be getting into by sort of sticking with the facts. So there's that piece of it. And then you asked about like health, mental health and well-being and anxiety. And I would say that we have a couple of folks that are part of the working group who really have done deep, deep work in that area. Christina Kwok, who is a former fellow with the Brookings Institute, who's actually going to be part of the closing panel at this conference, has done some great work and writing in that area. And then Laura Shifter, who is with the Aspen Institute and kind of facilitated that K-12 Climate Action Coalition and Commission, has done a fair amount of work. But yes, I mean, we will, I think we will use sort of the resources associated with the increasing evidence that, you know, children and students feel a lack of agency when it comes to dealing with climate change as we need to. I think I would just say that I have the privilege of working with folks who know, you know, far more about what the research shows on that than I do, and we will rely on their expertise. Yeah, and I think Brock puts sort of the bare bones of, you know, of what we've been saying for years, which is just that climate change is essential for addressing climate change. And again, I think that's something that we see in our field, you know, for eons, which is sort of the kind of minimization of the role of education in any of our efforts to address, complex environmental problems. And we need to change that. I mean, we just, I see that we are at time. I don't know if there are any other questions. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. And I will put my email address in the chat. I really do invite anyone that I'm not already in touch with to be in touch. Thanks, everyone.